The Department of Administration regulates many of the state's banks and financial institutions, but most notably, it provides services to other state government agencies. The majority of the services are managed through the department's Internal Service Fund. Through the fund, the department charges outside agencies for the services that they're provided. In one of our latest audit reports, we found that the fund generated around $614 million in revenue, while the department in total brought in over $2 billion within the audit period. Some notable uses of money for the department include roughly $410 million in benefit claims associated with the state benefit plan and $700 million in transfer outs. Transfer outs can most easily be explained as the movement of money between funds or accounts, often required by law. I'm content editor and host Eric Seidel, and I'm here with financial compliance auditor and the author of the Department of Administration Audit Report, Katie Majerus. Stay with us over the next few minutes as we give you what you need to know as you read the audit report and consider how your tax dollars are being spent. Okay, Katie, thanks for joining me today. How's it going?
It's going well. Happy to be here.
Katie, it's normally at this point that we have the auditors tell the listeners a little bit about themselves. So if you wouldn't mind just telling the folks who you are and maybe what it is you do here at the Legislative Audit Division.
I'm Katie Majerus. I'm a financial compliance audit supervisor with the office, and I was the contact for the Department of Administration audit. And I've done about a dozen audit reports in my time in the office.
And how long have you been with the audit division, and what was it that brought you to state government?
Well, I started as an intern in the office 11 years ago. I did my undergrad at Carroll College and then came and started an internship here for a summer, then went and got my master's in accounting and came back full-time, and I've been almost 10 years full-time in the office. What brought me here, I enjoy obviously the accounting side of things, but I had an opportunity to do a compliance audit internship prior to LAD, and I liked that side of it. So when this job came up that had both the number side and the compliance side, I jumped on it.
Okay, awesome. Well, I think it's safe to say that traditionally and historically, when people think of auditing, they think of money, financial audits. And that's exactly what you do. That's what you described. And you took a look at the Department of Administration here.
Yep, that's right.
Can you just walk me through an overview, maybe a timeline on how this audit worked for you? What did you start with? And as you put a bow on things, what did you finish with?
So for financial audits, we start by looking at the financial activity for a department. So we set a materiality threshold, which is a dollar amount that any activity over a certain dollar amount we will audit. We also look for activity that may be more risky for an agency. Once we decide what we're going to audit, we design audit steps, procedures to test that activity, looking at internal controls. And we also do analytics over the data. Once we complete our work, if we've found any misstatements or control deficiencies, that's what ends up in the blue cover report and in recommendations to the agency.
Katie, I teased a little bit in the opener, gave an overview on what the admin department does, and it may seem self-explanatory. They're the administration department, right? But from your point of view as an auditor, can you just give a little bit more clarity and maybe some more details to listeners as to what exactly the administration department does here in Montana?
The department really is the administration department for the state, so their main function is providing key services to all of the other state agencies. So, for example, things like accounting, human resources, technology for all of the state agencies. They manage the state's benefit plan. They maintain all of the state facilities. They're responsible for design and construction and repair of any new facilities. So anything that is provided to all state agencies is administered by the department.
Okay, and what do you look at when you audit a department like administration?
For a financial compliance audit, most of what we look at is documentation over internal controls. And by internal controls, I mean the processes and procedures that the department has to ensure that the financial activity is accurate. So that may be things like an approval on a payment to make sure the correct amount was paid, or maybe a reconciliation of monthly revenue collected. We also get down into the individual transaction level, looking at support. So that might be an invoice or maybe a bill or a state law that specifically states what needs to be paid or transferred out. I think the big difference for an FC audit versus maybe a performance and IS audit is just how many different aspects of the department that we look at. So just in this audit alone, we looked at benefit payments for the state's health plan, revenue collected for the Technology Services Division, building costs, construction costs for new buildings, loans that were made between agencies, money that was transferred because of legislation. We look at investment activity, some large settlements, insurance payments that the state received, the overall accounting function of the department. And then there's also activity that's allocated to the department, such as the state's lottery. So we send a team to go do work at the state lottery. And then additionally, the state administers the general fund. So we do a lot of work over the activity that flows in and out of the general fund. And at the end of the fiscal year 2022, the general fund had a little over $1.9 billion in it.
Okay, and if we're looking historically, what does that mean financially for the general fund? Is that number up, down, higher, lower?
So the 2 years that we covered, 21 and 22, were significantly higher than the previous years. And even from 21 to 22, the general fund grew by over $1 billion.
Katie, I can't help but wonder, we've heard so much about the amount of funding that went to all states during COVID for things like the CARES Act. Is it a safe assumption to make that at least partially the reason why the general fund has increased in its dollar amount is because of that federal funding to some degree?
Yes, the state received a lot of federal funding between the CARES Act and the ARPA funding, so that had a big impact on the state's general fund balance.
Okay, so now that we've established sort of what the general fund is and that it has increased with monies recently, how does that affect your objective when you go into an audit? Or does it even? To some degree, most financial audits, you're looking at money, so your objective probably doesn't change too much, simply when it comes to what you're looking for and at, within a financial compliance audit. So with that said, what were your objectives here in this audit with the Department of Administration?
So yes, the objectives for most financial compliance audit are pretty standard. For the most part, we have three main objectives. So the first one is determining whether the financial schedules are reasonable and a reader can rely on them. So the financial schedules are detailed information over the department's financial activity. They summarize the overall balances, revenue, expenditures for the department. And those financial schedules can be found in our blue cover reports. The second objective is getting an understanding of internal controls. And then if we find any issues with those internal controls, making recommendations for how the department can improve on them. And the third is looking at compliance with state laws or federal regulations that might drive that financial activity and making sure that the department has complied with them.
Okay, so we've given some key background information. We've talked about what your objectives were with this audit, and now we're at the start of the show, the findings and your recommendations. Katie, if you would just kind of start off with what was your first recommendation and your finding?
Our first finding and recommendation is related to what we refer to as service organizations. More and more state agencies are contracting with outside vendors or service organizations to provide some piece of their service. Departments are finding that contracting out for some of these services is more efficient and cost-effective than doing it themselves.
Okay, so with all that in mind, how does that lead to your recommendation?
Yeah, so in the cases of these service organizations, even though a separate vendor is providing the service, the department still needs to have its own internal controls and processes to make sure that that vendor or that software system is operating the way that it needs to. Most of the time, this is done by getting a report from the vendor that is completed by a CPA firm, and that CPA firm goes into the organization and provides some kind of an assurance that the vendor's controls and processes are working the way that they should. The report also tells the department what controls it needs to have in place, things like setting up the correct access to the system or making sure that the information or the data that they're giving the vendor is complete and accurate. So in some instances during the audit, we found that the department wasn't getting these reports at all, or in some cases they were receiving them, but they weren't reviewing them to see if there were any issues identified. And when it comes to controls the department needed to have in place, we found multiple instances where incorrect access was given to employees or access wasn't terminated for employees who'd left the department. Overall, as service organizations are used more and more by the department, it's important to make sure that they have controls in place and that there are no issues with the services that are being provided.
Okay, so essentially the department needs to do a better job of staying on top of the service organizations that they're using.
Yep, it really comes back to the internal control concept I talked about earlier. They need to have some kind of evaluation process or checks and balances in place to make sure that what they're getting from the vendor is correct.
Okay, so give me your first formal full recommendation. Overall, what did you end up going with?
Overall, we recommended the department obtain the control reports for its service organizations and that they review access to these systems to ensure appropriate access is granted.
Okay, let's move on to your second finding and recommendation.
Our second finding and recommendation was related to IT or information technology projects. The legislature funds IT projects for state agencies through the appropriation process.
Okay, and how does this apply to the department and what they do with the funds and how they appropriate them is what I'm guessing?
Yeah, through the legislation, the Department of Administration is ultimately given responsibility for managing and distributing these funds to the other state departments when they get IT projects started. The legislature was very clear in saying these funds can only be used for the designated IT projects. In the last few audits, we found that the department didn't have strong enough controls in place to make sure that the funds they distributed out are only used for the IT projects and not some other cost of a department. Since 2013, there's been over $140 million provided for these projects. So these are not small dollars, they're significant costs, and it's important to make sure that the money is being spent the way the legislature intended it to be spent.
Okay, and your formal recommendation is?
So we made a repeat recommendation to the department to enhance their internal controls and processes to make sure that the funds are being used appropriately.
Okay, moving on to your third finding.
Our third finding was an accounting-related issue. Part of our work is making sure that transactions are coded correctly in the accounting system to the correct account or fund, which ultimately makes sure that they roll to the correct row or column in the financial schedules. Ultimately, we're making sure that a reader is getting an accurate picture of the department's financial activity.
And how does that apply to the department, and why is it problematic?
So as part of our work, we identified multiple instances at the department where activity was misclassified and therefore is rolling to the wrong row in the financial schedules. As part of each financial audit, we give what we call an opinion on the financial schedules, an unmodified opinion if everything is good to go, or a modified opinion if we find issues. So because of these misclassifications, we issued a modified opinion, which means a reader can rely on the financial schedules except for the specific misstatements that we identified.
And with that opinion, the modified or unmodified, what does that mean to a normal person? Can you give me a little bit more information on that?
Yeah, I think if you're looking at the department's financial schedules and trying to get information from them, looking at our opinion is a good way of knowing whether there's issues you should be aware of or not. If it's an unmodified opinion, everything's good to go and you can rely on what's in there. If it's modified, you may want to take a look at what kinds of issues we found. In this case, there were just a couple amounts that were misclassified on 2 different lines on the financial schedules. In some cases, a modified opinion might be a much bigger deal. We might be saying, you can't rely on this activity at all. It doesn't give a complete or accurate reflection of a department's financial activity, so it's going to differ from case to case. In this case, there were just a couple lines that were misclassified.
Okay, so you've clarified there was a modified opinion, but it didn't really amount to too much. So in the end, where does that leave you with your recommendation? What is your formal recommendation?
Yeah, we recommended that the department classify their financial activity correctly per state accounting policy.
Okay, so here we are at your last finding. So give me your last finding and what makes it pertinent to the recommendation.
Our last recommendation was related to the department's state accounting function. One of the services that the department provides to the state is to make sure that the state has uniform accounting. And they're responsible for writing state accounting policy for departments to use and for making sure that all of the financial transactions are in the accounting system before the books close at the end of the year. They're also responsible for recording some transactions on behalf of other state agencies. We identified multiple instances where errors were made in transactions made on behalf of agencies, or that changes were made after the books close that then impacted other state agencies and may result in issues in their blue cover reports. Overall, the State Accounting Bureau's main focus is getting the state's ACFR, or Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, issued each year. And the ACFR is basically just a summary of all of the state's financial activity in one report. While that's important, they also need to consider the impact on all state agencies and their ultimate responsibility for complete and accurate financial reporting for the whole state.
Perfect. And that makes your final formal recommendation.
We recommended the department ensure uniform accounting and make sure that all transactions are properly recorded before the books close.
Okay, now with all this information, now that we've heard about your findings and your recommendations, tell me, why is this important to a reader of this report, or in our case, a listener? What makes this important?
Generally, not just for Department of Administration, but really any department audit, I think it's important for a reader to know that there are FC auditors out there that have a consistent presence at these agencies that are evaluating their processes and the services that they're providing to the state. Ultimately, from a money or funding perspective, we're providing assurance to any reader as a taxpayer or to legislators as lawmakers that the department is spending and managing their funds appropriately.
Right. And it sounds like at the end of the day, Katie, we're talking about taxpayer dollars, and we want to make sure there are folks out there checking and making sure the state is getting things right.
Yep.
All right. And as we close out this episode of the podcast, we obviously want to thank listeners of the show. But most importantly, Katie, I'd like to thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for joining me and doing the podcast with me.
Thanks for having me.
All right, well, that completes the episode of the Financial Compliance Audit of the Department of Administration. And if you're interested in reading Katie's full report, you can find it at leg.mt.gov/LAD under the Financial Compliance section. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.